Welcome back. My name is Martha Campbell, and I'm a lecturer at Berkeley. And for a long time, I've been involved in population issues, and involved in also in the disagreements and in this really sensitive field, which Sir John talked about also, and the population's impact on poverty, health, education, and the options that women need to have. When I was directing the population program in the David and Lucille Packard Foundation in the 1990s, I began to recognize how money can be used in different kinds of ways for making very large change in health and in family planning in a human rights framework. And on that basis, I founded the nonprofit organization with the improbable name of Venture Strategies for Health and Development. This morning, Sir John Solston looked at the global picture on the relationships between population consumption and well-being. Now we are going to focus on Africa. This is the continent with the most rapid population growth and also many of the world's least developed countries. Nations that cannot keep up with the rapidly growing number of children born each year, and where women want but often cannot get contraception when they want it. We are fortunate to have with us now Dr. Eliya Zulu. 2 years ago, Dr. Zulu established a new and unique institution called AFIDEP, the African Institute for Development Policy, in Nairobi, Kenya. He is doing what we often talk about in the School of Public Health at Berkeley, turning research into policy, actually translating research into policy for policymakers. It's a unique pattern of ways to work within a continent that needs help in many ways. Dr. Zulu, who was born in Malawi, is one of Africa's leading demographers. He has his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and he has just completed his 4 years as the elected president of all of Africa's demographers. It's a great pleasure to have him here. Eliya.
Thank you, Martha. And good morning. It's still morning, yes. So my talk today is going to build on a lot of what was said earlier on in the presentation that Sir John made, as well as what Ndola talked about for the most part. And basically, it's looking at the issues of the consequences of high fertility and population growth, looking at Africa as a special case. So what I'm going to look at, basically mostly three things. Look at population figures, the past and the future for Africa. Look at the consequences of high fertility. And for that, I'm focusing on three main areas. Population is a cross-cutting issue. It kind of affects every aspect of society, of development, and so on. So you can actually have a whole day of discussions just on the implications of population growth. But I'm focusing on issues to do with urbanization, schooling, and the extent to which the rapid population growth in Africa is affecting efforts to build the continent's human capital and maternal health. And then I'll finish the presentation by offering some sort of ideas on what we need to do in order to address this issue. First of all, starting with investment in education, empowering women, closing the funding gap and the service gap in family planning as well, which has been emphasized by Ndola Prata, and also building and nurturing political will and commitment. So the Dean, when he talked about what has been happening, as well as the last speaker in the last panel, emphasized the issue about progress that is being made in global health. And I think if you look at Africa, you can say that Africa still has the highest level of mortality among all the major regions, but it has made considerable progress in reducing mortality. So if you take infant mortality, the number of infant deaths out of 1,000 live births, it's gone from 180 to 71 between 1950 and 2010. And life expectancy at birth has also gone up from 38 to 58. This is one of the measures, indicators that has been affected somehow by the HIV/AIDS over the last 2 decades or so, but it has continued to go up. But fertility decline has been very, very slow. It started very, very late, and only in the last 10, 15 years are we noticing that the average number of births per woman is actually going down in the continent. So when we really talk about population growth, in a way I think we have to emphasize the point that Africa's high population growth, to begin with, it's a consequence of progress in health outcomes. It's because mortality came down at the time when fertility stayed at a very, very high level. That's why we had this high population growth. But it's the persistence of this gap between the birth rates and the death rates that has put Africa in a kind of a special category as far as rapid population growth is concerned. So Sir John showed you a map earlier on, but that's the second one I'll show you. But if you just look at how birth rates looked globally in around 1950, you see that having more than big families, more than 5 children per woman, was quite a global phenomenon. I mean, the red there is showing the countries and the regions where, on the average, women were having more than 5 births. So that was in 1950. But when you come to 2000, Africa is really the only region where this has remained an issue. So when we talk about Africa being a high fertility continent, what are we really talking about? Which are the countries there that have very, very high fertility? For the 52 countries that have data on total fertility rates at risk in the last 2 to 3 years, you see that 24 of them actually have average birth rates or average number of births per woman of more than 5. If you look at the other end, there are only 9 countries in Africa where birth rates are under 3. And these are mostly countries in North Africa. But if you go back there in terms of the high fertility countries, the highest is Niger at 7. Uganda 6.7, you go to Mali around 6.6 and so on. So the lowest you have is Mauritius, Tunisia, most of the countries in North Africa, although Mauritius is on the eastern side. So what is really the implication of this? If you look at the United Nations projections, the population of Africa was about 230 million in 1950. It grew to about, the current population is just above 1 billion. This population is projected to grow to about 2.2 billion by 2050 and to 3.6 billion by 2100. Basically, if we follow this pattern, it means that the population of Africa in 2100 will be half of the global population of about 7 billion that we have now. So the issue about the projections, the green charts here are looking at the actual numbers because it's the past. But is it orange? The other color is looking actually at projections. Population projections are mostly influenced by the 2 factors, fertility and mortality. And there's also migration. I didn't talk about migration. Migration in the context of Africa as a whole, you wouldn't say that it has a big impact on the change of the population, although there's a lot of internal movements within the continent and within the countries themselves. But when you look at the future, it's mostly the fertility rates that are going to determine how big the population of Africa will grow. So the chart that the projections I showed you right here are for the medium variant, where the total fertility of about 4.9 now is projected to go down to 2.1 by 2100. But if that doesn't go down, for instance, if the continent does better than that and reduce it by about half a child to 1.6, That's what the UN calls the low variant. And the other one, the high variant, is just half a child higher than the medium variant. So basically, you are seeing, according to the UN projections, a difference of 1 from high to low here. But these are the implications of that small difference. It's a difference of just 1 child in total fertility over a long period of time. The red curve there is showing you the median variant, which I already talked about. But if, for instance, fertility goes down further to about 2.6, it means that the population for Africa will actually go to about 5.2 billion, as opposed to 2.4 billion if it's the lower variant. So I just want you to understand here the importance of fertility, just even a small difference in fertility in long-term growth of population. So what are some of the consequences? According to 2 years ago, the world actually crossed one of the big milestones in terms of population. The global population became more urban than rural about 2 years ago. But it's projected that this milestone will take place in Africa around 2030, 2032, where there will be more people for the first time living in urban areas than in rural areas. So what this shows you is that the rural population will stabilize around 2035 and even start declining, while most of this growth in Africa will be happening in urban areas. And this will bring different sort of development challenges, health challenges, and so on. One of the things we need to note, I think a lot of people, when we talk about urbanization, we tend to think that it's mostly people coming from rural areas. But I think data shows that, in developing countries, natural increase contributes about 60% of urban growth, while 40% is due to migration and reclassification. But in Africa, actually natural increase has a much bigger impact. People who are actually being born within the urban areas themselves. And one of the consequences of this rapid urbanization is that there is now what we are calling urbanization of poverty, where we are having, quite high concentration of poverty in urban areas. And this is not just because of population growth, of course. There's also poor governance, poor planning. But what we are seeing now is that the majority of people who are living in urban areas, in cities in Africa, are living in slum settlements. This is a pictorial look at Kibera slum, which is one of the biggest slums in Africa, where in that small geographical area there, over 500,000 people are estimated to live there. And what are the conditions in slums? There's congestion, there's no proper drainage system for water, no garbage collection, no toilet facilities, rising crime, areas where, you look at Nairobi, whenever there's a cholera outbreak in the city of Nairobi, it starts in the slums. And all these health effects are likely to affect other non-slum dwellers as well. So if the issue about slums was maybe about small pockets of people here and there, one would argue that, okay, maybe it's not a big deal. But according to estimates from UN Habitat, about 62% of all urban dwellers in Africa live in slum settlements or slum-like conditions. This proportion has declined a little bit, maybe thanks to some of the efforts by the Millennium Development Goals framework and so on, from about 70% in 1990 to 62% in 2010. But because of the rapid urbanization, which is fueled by the natural increase in population growth, actually the actual numbers of people living in slums has more than doubled during this period. And it's actually estimated that by about 2020, 2030, there will be over 370 million Africans living in slum settlements. What are some of the consequences of this? So this graph here is from the slums of Nairobi, comparing under 5 mortality in green and infant mortality in blue in the slums of Nairobi and other parts of Kenya. And if you compare just the blue charts, you see that in the slums of Nairobi, under 5 mortality, the number of children dying out of 1,000 live births by age 5 is 151 versus 113 in rural areas. The same sort of difference for infant mortality. So you are having a situation where the continent is becoming more urban than rural in the next couple of decades or so. And most of the people living in urban areas are actually living in slum conditions. And if these are the health outcomes that we are going to be seeing in slum conditions, it means that the health outcomes, the health indicators in the slum communities will actually increasingly shape the national health indicators in these countries. Another effect of high fertility is that it actually creates youthful age structures where most of the people are young, and high momentum for growth for the population. Excuse me. So what you see here is the proportion of people in the total population in these parts of Africa. Globally, it's about less than 30 of the global population is under 15. In Northern Africa and Southern Africa, there are only 2 regions which have relatively low fertility, close to the global average in Africa. They have about less than 35%, but the other regions, between 40 and 45% of the total population is below age 15. I think that it's fair to say, given this dominance of the young populations in Africa, that Africa's development prospects largely depend on how well the continent turns its predominantly young population into a quality and productive labor force. But the reality is that rapid population growth makes it difficult for governments to expand education systems fast enough, even just to maintain the current standards, because the cohorts of children who are coming up to start school every year are increasingly bigger than the ones in the past. And also the Millennium Development Goals, if you look at the MDG for schooling, it focuses on universal primary education. But I think you'd agree with me that for Africa to develop, we need to shift our focus from universal primary education to universal secondary education. Because it's at secondary level that we start seeing big effects in terms of health outcomes, that I think you can start seeing people who can, be more, who can contribute more to economic productivity and so on. But the results, even for universal primary education in Africa, are quite discouraging. You find that some countries like Burkina Faso, for instance, 60% of girls aged 12 to 19 have never been to school. In northern Nigeria, if you look at women aged 15 to 49, 60% have never been to school. So the challenges are quite formidable. And another effect also of young age structures, as I said, is that it creates high momentum for the population to grow. So what this chart is trying to show you here is that even if, for instance, Kenya's total fertility now, the average family size is 4.6, even if it dropped to 2.1, which is what in demography we call the replacement level fertility, that is, the current generation is generating enough children just to replace itself. Even if this happened in 8 years' time in 2020 in Kenya, it doesn't mean that the population will stop growing outright. It will grow for another 80 years and stabilize at about, from its current level, of about 40 million to close to 80 million. But if the attainment of replacement level fertility is delayed, say, and attained in 2080, it means that the population of Kenya would actually stabilize at around 180 million. This is a similar chart for Nigeria. So how fast we get to replacement level fertility will affect the level at which the total population will stabilize. Rapid population growth is now interlinked with the environment and climate change. It's actually compounding effects of climate change and undermining the capacity of communities to adapt to its adverse effects. The picture on the left here is showing you flooding that is actually ongoing in the Zambezi Valley in southern Africa, parts of parts of Malawi extending into Mozambique and so on. And this now is becoming a recurring sort of a situation. Every year or every other year, there's massive flooding. On the other side, you see that there's also persistent droughts around the continent, undermining food security and so on. So one of the things you are seeing now with climate change is that, for instance, I was talking with a policymaker in Kenya last week at the National Environment Agency, who was telling me that one of the things they have observed is that in the past, the drought cycles used to take about 20 years. In about 20 years, 30 years ago, it reduced to 10 years. Now, every other year or every 2 years, there's a serious drought. There are changing disease patterns as a result of climate change. Some areas that never had malaria are now having malaria because of global warming. But the point about the link with population is that because of the rapid growth of population, a lot of people are now are settling in marginal areas, in lowlands, and being hit quite hardly by things like flooding and so on. I think we all heard about, the big famine that was announced in the Horn of Africa a few months ago. 13 million people were actually in danger, or they needed food assistance in order to survive because of the massive drought in that area. The Sahel, this region that extends from west to East Africa, below the Sahara Desert, it's extremely vulnerable to climate change consequences, but it's also an area where fertility rates and population growth is the highest actually in Africa. So people's capacity to build resilience, to adapt to consequences of climate change are being increasingly undermined as we face all these adverse consequences. For the Sahel, for instance, the population was about 20 million in 1950. It's projected to grow to about between 250 and 300 million, depending on the fertility scenario that you look at by 2050. I think Dola, talked about this already, the impact of high fertility on maternal health and child health. It's estimated, as she said, that between 30 and 40% use of family planning and reduction of high fertility would actually help avert 30 to 40% of maternal deaths. It's estimated that family planning can also help avert about 10% of child deaths. So high fertility is actually, high fertility is compounding poverty, compounding women's well-being, and so on. So I want to go a little bit into trying to say how can we really address these issues. And I hope that by doing this, I'll also highlight what are seen to be the main factors that are driving high fertility. So first, I think it's the issue that I mentioned. We need to end child marriages, keep kids in school, especially girls. In settings, like in most African settings, you get married at age 15, you start having children. You are less empowered to negotiate for use of family planning with your often much older, spouses and so on. This chart here is showing the median age at marriage in these selected African countries. And I think, as you can see here, there are about 29 countries there. In about 12 of them, half of the girls are married before age 18. And if you're getting married before age 18, basically you're going to have high fertility, but it also means you're dropping out of school. I think Dola also talked about the issue about unmet need for family planning. That about 20 years ago, a lot of leaders, African leaders and so on, used to argue that, Africans want to have many children. Let them have the children they want. Nobody should come and force them. But I think the data now has shown, data collected over the last 20 years has shown that the African women actually want to have fewer children. There's demand for family planning. What is making them have more children is not that they want the many children, but it's because we are failing to meet their needs for family planning. So, for instance, it was estimated in 2008 that 78 million African women wanted to avoid pregnancy, but only 40% of them were able to use modern family planning. If you don't have access to modern family planning, what happens? You have a lot of mistimed births and unwanted. So the orange here is mistimed births. The green is unwanted. But even in Southern Africa, where fertility rates are much higher, you see that a country like Swaziland, 37% of the births were not wanted by the women. The consequences are that you have also unsafe abortion. Dola talked about this as well. It's estimated that 6 million unsafe abortion happen in Africa, contributing 14% to maternal death. Another issue that we need to do is to increase donor and local funding for family planning. Malcolm talked about this. The orange bars here are showing you countries where per capita investment in family planning programs declined by over 50% between 1996 and 2006. And you can see that in Africa, Africa suffered quite a lot from there. Another thing we need to do is to strengthen healthcare systems. But more critically is to do what Ndola was saying, bring family planning to communities, demedicalize family planning, make communities take ownership of family planning. And finally, we need to build political will. In Africa, I'm just wrapping up. Yeah, in Africa, there's change, of course. There's a lot of progress being made in some corners, but there are still a lot of leaders who are suspicious about the motives of family planning. There are a lot of leaders who are not committed. There are a lot of leaders who still think that they need big populations in order to develop. So this picture, I took it, was taken in Rwanda. In November, I was there to try to understand what Rwanda has done. Why Rwanda, a country that had this very unfortunate genocide in 1994, lost about 10% of its total population, could decide to prioritize use of family planning as its central development pillar. So the president of the Senate basically told me we came to the conclusion that Rwanda cannot develop into a middle-income country, which is what they are aspiring for, without addressing rapid population growth. So look at Rwanda. The country has been committed. There's very, very strong political will, starting from the president, who has actually made all his ministers, mayors, and so on, use family planning as one of the performance indicators. And this is what we've seen in Rwanda. In 10 years, after this genocide, the percentage of women using modern family planning increased from 6% to 45%. If we focus on these 5 factors that I've mentioned, invest in women, keep girls in school, put money in family planning, and bring family planning to the communities, the rest of Africa can witness this progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliya. And I would like to invite then now the panelists to come to the podium right now, or come to the table. It's very helpful. There's one point I'd like to bring up that came up quite quickly, and I think a lot of people don't understand this. This little word reclassification between urban and rural, that most of the urbanization occurs because rural areas grow and they are called urban. It's not a matter of lots of migration. It makes a huge, huge difference to understand this. I would like to now introduce our panel. Dr. Mara Decker, CEO, here we are. These are all leaders. All 3 of these are leaders in different centers of excellence known as COEs within the Global Health Institute. Dr. Mara Decker's COE is devoted to women's health and empowerment. She is a lecturer at Berkeley, I'm happy to say, and at UCSF, she is the director of the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program Evaluation. Mara has worked in Bolivia, Kenya, and Angola. Dr. Kathryn Dewey is distinguished professor in the Department of Nutrition at UC Davis. Her COE is called One Health, and she is a widely published expert on maternal and child nutrition. Dr. Marc Schenker, who is a physician, is the director of the UC Davis Center for Occupational and Environmental Health. He is the co-director of the COE on Migration and Health. Mara, would you like to speak first? Thank you. Would you like to request to turn up the lights? Turn up. Can you turn up?
I can talk in the dark. I'm happy to begin. I would like to just begin my comments first talking a little bit about the Center of Expertise on Women's Health and Empowerment, and then secondly following up with a couple key points that Dr. Zulu also mentioned. So first, the Center of Expertise of Women's Health and Empowerment really believes that advances in women's health globally cannot be achieved without first addressing some of these fundamental issues of disempowerment and empowerment. So the impediments of poverty, limited access to education and economic opportunities, gender bias and discrimination, unjust laws, and insufficient state access and accountability. And as you can imagine, going through the previous speeches today, many of these same issues are directly impacting family planning and population. The mission of the Center of Expertise for Women's Health and Empowerment really is to address these causes of disempowerment, improve women's access to and control over resources, and to use improved access to resources and decision-making to achieve improved individual and community well-being and health. Some of the focus areas tie in directly to what we're looking at today. Increased human rights, focusing on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and also improved reproductive health technologies. An additional point that we look at are environmental threats, which, as you can imagine, often impact the people who are most vulnerable. So looking at cook stoves and firewood, issues like that for women, but also, as Dr. Zulu mentioned, some of the issues around climate change. The most vulnerable often are the women who are living either in flood-prone areas or coastal areas and who are least able to adapt to those changes. Two of the main points of the center is first, to really address any of these, you need an interdisciplinary approach. So we bring not only the people from the health sciences, but also anthropology, sociology, and law to really try to address in a more comprehensive way both the research and the solutions. And also that these two issues truly are interconnected. You can't only look at empowerment or only look at health without realizing how much these two work together. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the main points that Dr. Zulu mentioned, this looking at Africa in specific, the youth population that is here today. 90% of youth in the world today are in less developed countries. So not only the sheer number, but the percentage is really undergoing a huge shift. By 2050, that percentage that is within sub-Saharan Africa is going to be even larger, while within developed countries, not only is the percentage declining, but the actual number of youth is going to be lower. So what can we do to really harness the potential and the energy and enthusiasm of these youth? One of the points that Dr. Zulu made is this real issue around child marriages. If you're getting married before age 18, for example, in Mali, over 70% of women are married by that age. And worldwide, over 15 million women are married by age 15. So that's 11% of women are married at that age. You can imagine the impacts that has. That's the highest risk factor for death at that age in developing countries is actually maternal mortality. Youth, by and large, are a very healthy population, but getting married young and having children very young increases your risk dramatically. It's also 1/2 of new HIV infections are among youth. And getting married young also directly correlates with increased total fertility rates. The longer you are in a childbearing situation, the more children you're going to end up having. Finally, there's this idea that marriage can be a protective place, but in reality, women who are in marriage at an early age are at increased risk of HIV than their single counterparts, are much less likely to have access to the contraceptive they need, are much less likely to be using contraceptive than their sexually active single counterparts. So, in conclusion, just thinking about the synergistic effect of looking at empowerment and how it can really directly impact young women and young men's lives, what we can do to really make those changes. I'm going to end with a quote by Kofi Annan, that gender equality is more than a goal of itself. It is a precondition for meeting the challenge of reducing poverty, promoting sustainable development, and building good governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc.
Okay. Well, I want to just start by thanking my colleagues on the 10 UC campuses that are part of the Center of Expertise on Migration and Health. This is a group, many of whom are here today, working on this issue and aspect of global health. And I also want to thank Haile DeBas and the Global Health Institute, who actually helped bring us all together and harness this enormous energy on all 10 campuses. I'm going to make a few general comments on migration and its impacts on health, and then specifically focus on Africa and some of the issues that have been brought up. The first comment is that migration has been and will continue to be a natural phenomenon for all living species. It is a nature of our planet, and that goes from the original movement of humans out of Africa to the current manifestations of migration in the world. 1/7 of the global population is migrant. 1/7. This is a very large number, and we need to think about this in the health context. The second is that the major causes of global migration are likely to increase in the future, and we've heard some about that. So environmental change, the drought in the Horn of Africa, flooding, these phenomena around the world are moving people to other locations. Political change, and this, of course, has affected Africa as well as other parts of the world where we see regime changes and other migrations of political nature that are forcing people to become refugees. And then finally, the largest mover is the demographic and economic disparities in the world. And when we talk about population growth, hand in hand with that is the economic disparity that is going to push those people to moving to areas of more economic resources where they can survive better. Next is that migration has many impacts, but a lot of these on health are negative. And that is not just in the destination locations, but also in the countries of origin. We see impacts of migration on the health of the population, and certainly in the transit. The movement of people is hazardous. It has negative health consequences. And just to mention a few of these, mental health isn't brought up a lot, but the mental health, the stress, the impacts on migrant families or when part of the family is moving is enormous and is an enormous global health issue. Infectious disease is the traditional domain of migration and health and remains an issue to be thought about. But we need to think about chronic diseases. And from my own work, for example, we see that Latin women coming to the United States increase cigarette smoking fourfold. The impact on their chronic disease outcomes is going to be enormous from just that change alone. Occupational health is another area, and so on. So all of these are intertwined with the movement of people and need to be thought about. Our social protections for health are deficient for immigrant populations, particularly in the area of public health, where we see lower vaccination rates, lower prevention, lower environmental quality, and so on. But then also in health care, migrants tend to have lower access, lower resources, and lower benefits from healthcare systems. So we need to shift the paradigm away from what used to be the approach to migrant populations, which was sort of exclusionary. We're going to isolate these people, we're going to quarantine them, we're going to check for disease, to one in which we're reducing these inequities, that we recognize this is a phenomenon that exists. That we put in place social protections for health, that we reduce risk factors in this population, and that we bring up the overall health level. and it needs to have a population focus, not just an individual focus to make this effective. So how do we do this? Well, we need new operational frameworks that recognize migrant populations as a population of greater need in this regard. We monitor health in migrant populations. We change our healthcare system so that they're sensitive to the needs of migrants, unlike excluding migrants, as unfortunately we often see. We change policies, and importantly, that we do this in a multinational context, not just in the receiving countries where we say, oh, how do we deal with our migrants here? But we deal with it bilaterally or multilaterally to address the problem. So let me briefly look at Africa, just to make a few points. Africa, of course, is a country of origin for migration to developed countries. There are about something over 1 million black African immigrants in the U.S. It's only 3% of our immigrant population, but it's the fastest growing group. And a lot of these are, again, political refugees, one of the drivers of migration. But interestingly, the other point to mention is the remittances. And remittances from African migrants in other countries is almost $60 billion per year, which is greater than the gross domestic product of 39 countries in Africa. So this gets at the complexity of this whole migration and health picture, and something that needs to be taken into account to think about it. Now, there's also transnational migration within Africa, and that totals almost 20 million people in Africa who are living outside their countries of origin. A lot of this, again, is economic driven, but also environmental and political, moving this type of movement. About half of these migrants are women, and that needs to be recognized. In fact, if we look globally at migration, about 40% of global migration is between countries in the Southern Hemisphere. It's not Southern Hemisphere just to Northern Hemisphere developed countries. A large, almost half the global migration is within the Southern Hemisphere, such as the example in Africa. So let's just a couple of health issues related to this. Certainly HIV, which has been talked about, and malaria have been looked at, and the impact of migration on spreading those diseases. And that's a very real example, but I would suggest there's been little work on other health problems associated with migration, and we need to do this better. We need to look at the impact of migration on a whole range of these other outcomes I've been mentioning. So finally, we need to develop modern approaches to recognizing and addressing the health of migrant populations and their impact on health. The old method, the exclusionary method, the quarantines, just is not appropriate or even possible. And this certainly applies in Africa, where we've heard in the presentations about drought, we've heard about rural-urban migration, and certainly the impacts in those slums, which is where most migrants are going to end up when they do move in that situation. And then I want to just finish with another quote from Kofi Annan. He's becoming the Yogi Berra, I guess, of global health quotations, but Kofi Annan said, "We now understand better than ever that migration is not a zero-sum game. In the best cases, it benefits the receiving country, the country of origin, and the migrants themselves." And I think that's the way we need to think about this, not as a burden, not as an unfortunate transient state, but a natural phenomenon that exists and that can be of benefit within its cycle to everybody affected. So thank you very much.
Kathryn. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank both of our plenary speakers this morning for stimulating a lot of thinking about these really broad and important issues. I am involved in the One Health Center. I'm not one of the co-directors. They could not be here today, but I was asked to come and tell you a little bit about that. This is a center that has a very broad interest in the interacting multiple causes of poor human and animal health globally that includes things like unsafe and scarce water, lack of sanitation, food insecurity and malnutrition, and infectious diseases. And this is what we call the foundations of health, which Sir John referred to in his slide as the infrastructure. And it's a very ambitious way of looking at how to tackle these problems because they seem almost too much to cope with. But I think we would argue that we have to look at them simultaneously if we're going to make progress at addressing the huge issues in front of us. I'm also wearing a second hat today. I'm the director of the program in International and Community Nutrition at UC Davis. And I want to just give one example of how some of the work that we do feeds into the population issues that were raised this morning. And that has to do with the issue of number of children or family size and the important role of child mortality in affecting those kinds of decisions. The example was given this morning about the woman in Niger whose children are starving and then she's having another baby. And one of the reasons she's having another baby is because her children are starving and dying. So when half of your children die, you need to have more children to make up for that. And so I want to give the example of how infant feeding and infant nutrition are an important part of how we tackle that. If we reduce child mortality, in essence, we reduce the demand for large families. Breastfeeding is one of the critical pillars of that in several ways. For example, in the first 6 months of life, if a baby is exclusively breastfed, which is the global recommendation, they're much less likely to die. If they're not breastfed, they're 14 times more likely to die. And if they are partially breastfed, they are three times more likely to die in the first 6 months. One particularly salient, relatively new finding, is that the initiation of breastfeeding within the first hour after birth is a critical determinant of neonatal mortality. There are some studies from Ghana and Nepal indicating that neonatal mortality, which is deaths in the first month of life, could be reduced by 20% if all babies were put to the breast within the first hour. Now, that's a huge impact because currently, of all deaths under 5, neonatal deaths make up 41%. So this means approximately 1 million babies per year that could be affected by universal initiation of breastfeeding within the first hour. So there's other ways that breastfeeding plays into this because it also improves nutrition of the child, which has its own further effect on mortality subsequently. And other infant feeding practices that occur after that first 6 months are also critical in ensuring child survival and health and development. The other way that it works is that breastfeeding can play into birth spacing because of the suppression of amenorrhea in women who are not using contraceptives. This could be an important part of birth spacing. So that's just one small example, but those of us working in this domain believe that nutrition really is at the crux of both the population issues that we're facing, the global health issues that we're facing, and economic development as well, because improved nutrition in the first 2 years of life has been demonstrated to lead to greater wage earnings among males later and a greater school performance among females in particular. So one message I'd like to leave you with is that we need to pull these all together and work jointly to address the issues that we're all concerned about. And there are some good examples of that occurring already. For example, there's a trial being led here, a couple of trials being led here by UC Berkeley called the WASH Benefits Study funded by the Gates Foundation, which is started out as an intervention in 2 countries, Bangladesh and Kenya, to improve water, sanitation, and hygiene through a variety of means. Thinking through the issues where the outcome here was child health and child stunting, it was recommended that they consider adding nutrition to that project. And so those of us at UC Davis were brought into that project to work together to have these addressed at the same time. Another example is addressing infectious diseases and nutrition simultaneously. We're actually currently working in Malawi to examine that both during pregnancy and in early childhood. And a third example that I think is necessary for intersectoral collaboration is nutrition and agricultural development. Too often, agricultural development specialists focus on productivity, yields, calories, just how much food is out there, and not the quality of that food and the nutritional adequacy for these particularly vulnerable groups. So with that, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and hope that we'll have some vigorous discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. It's time for us soon to go and have lunch, but I'd like to leave some time for a couple of questions, and first I'd like to make a couple of comments also. We have good evidence. There is a correlation, of course, between lower mortality and smaller family size, but there is also a lot of causal relationship in the fact that what is really, it's not a prerequisite to have mortality come down first before family size comes down. What is prerequisite for lower fertility is, in fact, women's ability to be able to manage whether and when to have a child. We're dealing with this all the time, and it's very interesting subjects and very interesting discussions going on both in the Bixby Center at Berkeley and in Venture Strategies for Health and Development. And let me pull together just a few threads here on these two plenaries. Rapid population growth is a reality. 83 million more births than deaths every year on this planet. It is like a new Germany to squeeze into our already crowded planet in the next 12 months. There were 29,000 more births than deaths since we opened this meeting this morning. Nearly all of this growth will be in the least developed countries of the South. Most of the climate threat and the loss of nature's services comes from overconsumption in the North. A child born today could grow up in an increasingly hungry, conflict-ridden world with irreversible destruction of our common fragile environment, which in fact we need to preserve for tomorrow's children. Or that child could grow up in an increasingly peaceful world with little poverty and increasing human well-being in a biological, sustainable economy. As Ndola showed us, there is a large unmet need for family planning, and we know how to respect and help women to have family size that they want. The needed investments and the policies need to be made possible must start largely in the North. I want to thank Sir John and Dr. Zulu and the panelists for making this case in all its complexity. And this is the second time the Global Health Institute has been a sponsor of this type in the Bay Area meeting. I hope there will be many more such meetings, but I think it was appropriate that the goal of this meeting was to put population and voluntary family planning center stage in any global health activity. I hope we have succeeded. And now we need, let's have a couple of questions, and after that, then we'll need the logistics for feeding 450 people in the North for lunch. But are there a couple of questions? So somebody like to ask something fairly to me? Yes, please go ahead.
So let me just ask
Can you
panel.
put it on the microphone?
Sure.
Yes, that would be very nice.
Hi, Michael Drake from UC Irvine. And just to the panel, I'm curious about the chicken and egg relationship between family size and education, and what you'd like to say about that.
I think you're exactly right. The chicken and egg works perfectly, and you can see this both in other countries, but also in our own country. One of the projects I work on is in California, and while there certainly is a very strong association between teenage pregnancy, for example, and people who don't graduate from high school, there's also now further understanding that many of the people who didn't graduate from high school were those who were most likely to get pregnant early on. So there's definitely a chicken and egg. That said, in just about any country you go to, the higher the education attainment, even from nothing to primary level, secondary, and beyond, you'll see that stair-step association with childbirth. So the longer that a girl especially is able to stay in school, the lower her fertility will be.
Eliya?
Oh, can I just...
Is this on?
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think, Yeah, I think that the evidence on the ground, drawn from both Asia and Africa as well, is that education tends to be very, very helpful in influencing, say, contraceptive use, reducing fertility in contexts where family planning is not widely available. So if the women have to hunt for it, access to information, helps a lot. So you see that even the education advantage is much bigger in countries where contraceptive use is not widely available. But evidence from Nigeria, I mean, you're looking at Rwanda now, all these African countries that are making progress. Malawi is one, of the levels of education among the least in Africa. But 45% of women are using contraception and so on. So when contraception is more widely available, there's a diffusion effect as well, where women, look at other, even non-educated women can use it. So I think the choice, a lot of people tend to come up and say, okay, educate women and women will decide on their own to limit their fertility and so on. But the evidence is that if you actually educate women, with information about family planning, the need to take charge of their reproduction. If you invest in that and make family planning widely available, both educated and uneducated women take charge of their reproduction.
That's very interesting. Is there one more question here? Or shall we go on? Thank you very much, Chancellor Drake. What I'd like to do then is suggest that we all go to International House in a large crocodile, which is a lovely analogy used in Britain, and to walk up to International House. I understand that there is a very good lunch up there, and then we will come back here, and there are posters to see, and then we'll come back here at the appointed time. Thank you.